What were the reasons why the Vatican ordered the burning of documents related to the Spanish Inquisitions in India? And what kind of atrocities did these individuals commit that these documents needed to be burned? First of all, there wasn't a Spanish Inquisition in India. There was an Inquisition that's called the Goa Inquisition. It was so. How did the Goa Inquisition begin? So the Portuguese were at the time, let's say in the 16th century, in occupation of Goa. They had captured parts of Goa, Western India, west coast of India, and they were occupying Goa, and they wanted to convert everybody to Christianity. They did not like India's indigenous culture and religions. So there was this fantastic gentleman whose name was Francis Xavier. You may have seen various schools in India named Saint Xavier's School, Saint Xavier's College, and so on. It's a very popular name in India for schools and colleges, Saint Xavier. So this individual, Francis Xavier, is who these Saint Xavier schools and colleges are named after. Okay, so this person, Francis Xavier, was a missionary. He was a Jesuit missionary, and he was in Goa in the 16th century. Okay, let's say middle of the 16th century, 1500s, 1550s, 1560, around that time. Okay, and this guy, maybe 1540s. He died in 1550 something. Okay, Francis Xavier. So before that, when he was in Goa, he wrote to the King of Portugal asking for an inquisition in Goa, because the people of Goa, though some of them had been forcibly converted to Christianity, they were secretly practicing Hinduism. And they were secretly keeping idols, evil idols of Indian deities in their houses and secretly praying to them, that sort of thing. So something had to be done about these things. Something had to be done about these people, these evil Indians who would not convert properly to Christianity in Goa. So Francis Xavier wrote to the King of Portugal, and he asked for a proper inquisition in India, in Goa. So the Goa Inquisition begins somewhere around 1560. Okay. So the Goa Inquisition was this brutal oppression of the people of occupied Goa. Anyone who was accused of being a heretic or being a crypto Hindu or being disrespectful to Christianity, etc., they would be brought to the court, the Inquisition court tribunal, and sometimes they would be imprisoned for years before they would actually the hearing would happen, and they would be tortured in the hearing. So first of all, they would not be told who had accused them of whatever. Secondly, they would be tortured in a variety of horrific ways. You know, the Europeans, the Catholics came up with all kinds of most horrific torture methods. I shall not go into the specifics and the details. You can look it up online. They had these instruments that would tear the breasts of women, and they had something called strappado. I'm just giving you two or three examples. Strappado or something. They would hang a person, from their wrists but behind the body, and then they would drop the person repeatedly so that the shoulders would get dislocated and the person would be in agonizing pain forever, essentially. There was something called what was it called? Yeah, there were, I forget the names. Okay, there are all kinds of horrific names of these various torture methods and instruments. There was the garrote, which was a method of execution. There was something called the auto da fe, that was public burning of people alive. Some people would have their hands cut off. There is this famous pillar in Goa, the Hath Katro Stambh, it's called, I believe, where I don't know how many thousands of people had their hands cut off. So all kinds of horrific, brutal methods of torture and oppression and murder. Okay, a murder sanctioned by the church. The objective was to ensure that Hindus did not reconvert or did not practice Hinduism in private. The objective was to intimidate and brutalize the people so badly that they would become devout Christians, that sort of thing. Okay, and they held God knows how many trials of people, and all of that was recorded. All of this was recorded. Okay, so this begins in the mid 16th century, 1560 or something onwards. And then after a century or two, by the early 1800s, after a century and a half of horrific oppression, destruction of temples, they re-engineered the Indian society. You know, historically, society, villages would have their own village institutions like panchayats or whatever. So the Portuguese imposed new rules that no decision could be made unless all the Christians who had converted to Christianity in the village were present in the assembly or meeting or whatever, and the head had to be Christian, and all kinds of such rules were made, such that people had no choice but to eventually get you know have to be forced to convert to Christianity. Temples were destroyed. Hindu priests were not allowed to officiate in weddings, um, and all kinds of atrocious rules. And of course, the torture and the executions of people, burning people alive, all of that. So this went on for a century and a half, roughly. And all the trials, all the proceedings were recorded in great detail by the Portuguese. Now, in the early 1800s, you have the rise of the Maratha Empire. By the time it becomes the dominant force, right? The Maratha Empire. Um, in the well, in the 18th century, in the 1700s, 1750s, the Maratha Empire reaches the peak of its power, and eventually the Marathas go after. There is conflict between the Marathas and the Portuguese. So in the early 19th century, the Portuguese viceroy in Goa, he decided that the records, the documents, the archive of the Inquisition, all the proceedings, all the people who were tortured, all the people who were accused, all the people who were executed in various forms, various ways, etc. This archive, this documentation was politically dangerous. That's what the Portuguese viceroy decided. So he ordered the destruction of the overwhelming majority of the records of the Inquisition. So it was not ordered by the Vatican, it was ordered by the Portuguese viceroy in Goa. This happened in the early 19th century, okay, in the early 1800s. So what they did was they took some selected records, a few, I don't know what the quantity of the records was, and those records, whatever they felt were the most important or whatever was worth preserving, they sent these records to the Portuguese court in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro. Okay, and these apparently are still there in the National Library in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And the rest of the documentation, the rest of the archives, the rest of the documents were all burned, destroyed. We have no idea how much documentation was burned. From the documents that do exist, it looks like there were like some 15 to 20,000 trials were performed based on whatever has survived, and it says maybe 200 people were executed. That's what it says roughly. Okay, but the overwhelming majority of the records were destroyed, burned. So that is what happened. It wasn't the Spanish Inquisition, it was the Goa Inquisition conducted by the Portuguese. It wasn't the Vatican that ordered the burning or destruction of documents. It was the viceroy, the Portuguese viceroy of Goa in the early 19th century who decided this has to be done because it was too politically, etc., dangerous. It would show Portugal in a bad light. It would show Christianity in a bad light. All the nasty stuff, horrific atrocities they had done, all the records probably were meticulously listed and documented. All of that was destroyed. So these were human rights abuses. This was possibly genocide at a certain scale. Now, we don't know, right? We can only rely on perhaps the oral records of people who passed down the stories. Most of them eventually became so fervently Catholic that they denied anything. I mean, talking about the Goans, those who converted, they eventually became so fervently Catholic that they denied anything had been done to their ancestors and so on. Over time, that gets into your blood, I suppose. So most of the evidence has been destroyed by the Portuguese, by the church, the records were in the custody of the church people, I suppose, of the Portuguese. So they destroyed it all to hide what they had done to Indians. So that today, if you try to look back upon that part of our history, we don't have any actual records of what the Portuguese did, apart from the little bit that is in the National Library in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. So they destroyed the evidence. It's like the Nazis destroying evidence of the Holocaust, all the records of the Holocaust. That sort of thing the Portuguese did in India. So the atrocities they committed, we will never know, I suppose. The scale of the brutality, the scale of the atrocities, we'll never know. So this was done to cover up their tracks. It was done to cover up their atrocities, their human rights abuses, their genocide, their, what they did. So it must have been horrific. It must have been so horrific that they decided it should not ever be made public. And that's why they burned it all. All right. So that was the deal about the Goa Inquisition, brought into India by Francis Xavier, this Jesuit missionary. Okay.